I got the gif up. Scump was saying on the watch party. He said it like uh earlier in the day, like Atlanta's gonna play like Minnesota or something, lose first round, and then play us first round for top 12. And that's exactly what happened. My streams aren't working. I think it's just my internet. Do I sound alright to you? There you go. I'm like super far behind on delay. I don't know why. It's definitely me though, because I got like the spinning wheel of doom. So my internet. Hopefully, I don't lose internet. That would suck. Huh. Alrighty. Yeah.
Hello and welcome to episode 160 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we're talking more OpTic. Not as much as we talked about OpTic on the last episode, but I'm sure there will be some considerable conversation after OpTic picks up their first win of the qualifiers. And we're going to talk about those qualifiers as they finished up just a little bit ago. The qualifiers are all done. Major 2 seeding is ready to go. Major 2 starts next weekend. So we have a lot to talk about. Before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Yeah, like you said, interesting way to close out the qualifiers, and Selection Sunday for college basketball enjoyers. And I guess it's kind of fitting that we won't cover the bracket as in depth today, but there's multiple brackets for you to fill out in the next couple days if you're a COD sports fan and a college basketball fan. But nonetheless, yeah, we had 10 qualifier matches this past weekend. Some pretty juicy matches and some good stuff to talk about. So ready to hop right in?
Yeah, we start off with Friday, March 14th. The first match is Vancouver versus Toronto. We both put the Surge here because they had been pretty much killer since they made this roster change, bringing in Neptune. Toronto had looked kind of iffy, at least compared to what they had been going like at the beginning of the regular season. But Vancouver actually loses this one 3-2. Toronto wins. They win 6-2 in the final S&D. They win 6-4 in the first S&D. Search was their point of strength basically earlier in the year, and then that kind of fell by the wayside. And I think that was part of the reason that they weren't able to win so consistently. I mean, when you're winning, I think it was like 85% of their searches in that first qualifier or first major qualifiers. And once that is not the case anymore, it's pretty hard to keep that up and keep winning consistently. But they're able to pull this one off. What are some of your takeaways here? Obviously, this is an upset, even if it isn't as big as some of the matches that maybe we'll talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, I mean, this is the first series loss for Vancouver since the addition of Neptune that didn't come against LA Thieves. And although it wasn't against Thieves, it very much so mirrored at least that best of 7 from the minors, where Vancouver was able to win the hard points, but they lost the S&Ds. That's the same thing that happens here. Vancouver wins both hard points, sorry, and they lose both S&Ds in the control. I think it's a little fitting that Toronto, showed out a little bit in the search and destroys here, just because I literally went back last week and looked in the notes, and last week was when Toronto played Vegas, and Vegas beat them in search. And I don't want to say I made a big deal about it, but I said, I think if there was any consideration of Toronto still being one of the best search teams in the game, or the best search team in the game, that kind of, you kind of have to lose that title, at least for the time being, with that loss to Vegas. And then they, of course, naturally respond by beating Vancouver in 2 searches. But it's not like Vancouver has been a great search team, because, as we said, they lost the searches to LA Thieves. But that's like really, I think the bigger picture thing is that they lost to a team that isn't named LA Thieves, and that's the first time we've seen that since Neptune came in. So it does show, this team is beatable. For some of these other teams, I think it's really a bigger win for Toronto than it is a loss for the Surge, just in the sense of, like, Toronto's kind of been in that spot, I feel like, at least in my mind, where it's like, they had a strong start to the season, didn't have the best start to uh the land portion of the league. They come back into these qualifiers, they have that fluky, well, I don't want to call it necessarily fluky, but the weird match against Cloud9 online, where Kleenex had a historically bad performance, but there might have been some server stuff going on. And then, so since then, they've played better and more like the Toronto we saw earlier in the season. So that could be a sign of better things to come. Joe Deceives has really just been frying for these guys. So I think this is a big win for Toronto, and I'm not necessarily like super worried about Vancouver, but I do think, just in general, it shows that, it's not like, especially when Vancouver has beaten Atlanta FaZe twice, them losing to another team just shows, like, I guess, the rest of the league and the fans that it is possible. It's not like they're only going to lose to LA Thieves now. So that was my takeaway here.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, that it is a bigger win for Toronto than the loss is for Vancouver. And Vancouver, I think we've mentioned this multiple times, S&D is typically the last thing to come for a lot of these teams, because that requires a ton of teamwork. And obviously some of these teams, like Toronto, has not made a roster change all season long. So you would theoretically think that they're kind of improving upon their search and destroy, and kind of refining some of their strategies as the season goes along, where Vancouver has had a relatively small amount of time to do that with this particular team and with Neptune in the roster. So if there is some kind of optimism for Vancouver, it might be that it's going to take time to kind of get their S&D up to snuff, and maybe it won't be to the level that they necessarily want, but I think that it probably will get better as time goes along. I want to skip this next match real quick, and then we'll just talk about the final match on Friday, because there's really not a ton to talk about in that match, and I'm sure we'll kind of spend a little bit on the LAT OpTic match. But Carolina versus Miami was the last match on Friday. It was a 3-0 for Carolina. Nothing really jumped out to me. I don't know if anything jumped out to you, but it was a decently close hard point, and then Carolina kind of took it away. We both expected the Royal Ravens to win. Miami has been pretty, I can't say disappointing, because I didn't expect anything particularly big from them, I guess. But Carolina wins this. Anything from this match?
I do think it, there are probably many other people like us in pick'ems or whatever who thought Carolina would win this match, just based on the teams or the way they've both been playing recently. But we can't forget that Miami is the team that eliminated Carolina from Major 1. Miami got 3rd at that event, Carolina got 4th, and Miami is the team that got knocked Carolina out. So it's not like this was, I don't want to say it was a revenge match or anything like that. Like, I don't think, especially the way both teams have been playing, I don't think it was like circle like that, but it's got to feel good for Carolina too. to, I guess for lack of a better term, get their revenge against the team that knocked them out Major One. Both teams are in a little bit of a different spot heading into Major Two now, so I would be surprised if we get another third, fourth matchup between these two teams in particular. But stranger things have happened in Call of Duty. I just think overall, Gwen has been absolutely frying in the hard points. I think it was last week. I have the last week's notes up here somewhere. I just don't remember what match it was against C9. Gwen went 38 and 21, not once but in both hard points against C9, and then he follows that up with a 41 bomb in map one here against Miami. He's just been frying in the hard points. And then if Gwen's able to do that and they're able to win the hard points, they take a search 6-1 here. Like we've talked at length about Carolina and how search should be what their strong suit is as a team with guys like Slasher and TJ, even Vivid. So if that's the recipe for success right there. If Gwen's frying, you capitalize on that, win those maps, you take the searches, you should be looking good, and that should be Carolina's recipe for success. And then again, I think I talked about it a while ago at this point now, but like Slasher here, 31 and 11 in the protocol control map 3. He played really well online in the first set of qualifiers. I don't have the exact stats to back up this upcoming statement, but I know it was like, his statistically, he didn't play as well at the LAN tournament Major 1 as he did online in the qualifiers, which is just an anomaly because that's what I thought I was saying. I was excited for Major 1 to see Slasher back on LAN after his, break at the end of last year. And then in these qualifiers, I feel like he played pretty well in several situations, even though Gwyn was definitely the highlight player from a statistical standpoint. So I am just interested in general to see Slasher back on LAN, maybe Major 1, the travel overseas and all that just wasn't his deal and whatnot. But I think Carolina's in a pretty decent spot right now heading into the major in the sense of like, I wouldn't say if, gun to my head, I have to pick one team to win the event. I'm probably not going with Carolina. But if we're looking at a group of teams that doesn't include Thieves and FaZe to win the tournament, they have to be among those contenders.
Yeah, I think it's, I would say I'm not going to pick them against some of the top teams, especially if they play LAT, for example.
Yeah.
Like LAT has been really dominant in general, but especially against Carolina. But if you came into the season and you told me like Carolina would be one of like the top 4 or 5 teams going into the first 2 majors of the season, I wouldn't have believed you at all. And now they are like, this is just what we expect of them. Like, this isn't a surprise that they won this match. It's not a surprise that they really win most of these matches. Like, they went 5-2 in these qualifiers. Like, that's such a huge step up from the expectations that we had for Carolina coming into the year. That should be just like something that we kind of praise and give credit to these guys. Like, this team wasn't thought to be much anything. We even talked about at the beginning of the season, like how this is 3/4 of the team are question marks, essentially. Like, what are we going to get out of these guys? Are these guys going to be in the CDL next season? And of course, that's always going to be a question, even as you get to the end of the season to see what happens and whatnot. But the fact that they're able consistently to win these matches is pretty crazy.
And they went 5-2 in these qualifiers. They went 5-2 in the Major 1 qualifiers as well. And that means they've won 5 in a row now, not counting the minor, because I specifically remember them going 0-2 in the first week of Major 2 qualifiers and us sitting here being like, oh, they got some tough matches coming up. I believe it was Minnesota and OpTic in the second week of these qualifiers before the minor. And I was like, they have a tough week there. Like, maybe we're talking about roster changes here for this Carolina team, and they've rattled off 5 wins in a row in the qualifiers, not counting the minor, and they're 16-8 on the season, in third place overall in the CDL, only behind FaZe and Thieves. I mean, that's definitely, like you said, you told me that heading into this. I don't think there were very many people who would think they'd be in that position right now on March 16th, 2025.
Yeah, they lost the first 2 matches to LAT and Toronto, and then, they, like you said, played Minnesota and OpTic that second week. They swept both. and then they had the minor. They beat LAG. They lose to LAT, which kind of continued that that trend, and then beat C9 Miami and Vegas to finish out these major two qualifiers. Like that's pretty crazy. Like that's just like granted. Some of those teams are not very impressive, especially like OpTic right now has just been all over the place. Vegas has been bad, obviously, but like this was a team that I thought would be, like having trouble with Miami, and there's no guarantee that they beat C9, and they've done this consistently. Like they've had a few hiccups here and there, but for the most part have been pretty solid, which is just incredible to think, about like this roster in particular doing that. The second match on Friday, the one that I wanted to kind of save, was probably the most talked about match of the weekend. I think even including the Sunday match that we'll talk about. But LAT versus OpTic, obviously the HBR Classic has delivered some bangers in the past. This was not a banger in the sense that this was like really competitive, but there was so much talk coming out of this match in particular. LAT wins 3-0. It is not very close. I guess, there's about 100-point win on hard point, 6-3 win search. So there's nothing that's like the skin of their teeth. I looked at the breaking point comments, like you can look under the match, and it said LAT DoorDash, and that kind of I think says quite a bit about how quick and how dominant the series was for LAT. Obviously, the talking points were for OpTic though. People expected LAT to win. OpTic continued their losing streak here. They fell to 0-6 and 0-18 in map count with this loss. And our boy Kenny probably had he literally had one of the worst Call of Duty series of all time, at least at the professional level. Originally, it was thought that he had a .3 KD in this series, which would have been the single worst series KD of like all time. I think this is according to Gamepedia, and some of these matches go back to 2014 champs, ESWC. Yeah. So it's like the major events basically in Call of Duty history. That would have been the worst. Thankfully, he had a .32, which is tied for third worst of all time. Obviously, Kenny has been kind of the talk of the town, so to speak, and his play has been really, really criticized, especially as OpTic has continued to lose. Your thoughts on OpTic's loss here, which is not a surprise necessarily, but OpTic continuing to lose every single map, and then Kenny also having one of the worst series of all time.
Yeah, I think that's like the big, no matter how you want to try and phrase it or what, how you want to break it down, it's just point blank, like Kenny had a really poor statistical performance here. And even if he stepped it up a little bit, I don't think it really would have made that much of a difference. Like, obviously it would for his confidence, and it would save him from being memed and whatever. But just at this point, OpTic had been absolutely getting just dunked on by every single team. And after this map, they were 0-6 in the major two qualifiers with an 0-18 map count. Like, I get the whole narrative around Kenny. Like, it's very easy to, rag on him and whatnot, but that is not the reason, the single reason why OpTic lost this match. Sure, him playing at that level didn't help things or didn't, it just wasn't it's not like Kenny drops a .32 and that's why OpTic lost to LAT. Like, no, LAT had been one of the best teams in the game heading into this match, and OpTic had been one of the worst teams in the game heading into this match, regardless of how each individual player on each team is playing statistically. So yeah, it's it's gonna be I think no matter how you break it down in terms of like the eras of COD and like pre-CWL, CDL, whatever, it's easy to say it is one of the worst statistical performances in the CDL era by far, might be number one as the worst, and it is one of the worst individual performances that we statistically have been able to, like track the numbers for, in competitive Call of Duty history. There's no way around that. Like the reason I say it like that is because I just know there was like, in some of the old days, like there were matches like I remember that I'm pretty sure Momo, who used to cast, was like on the team that lost 250-6 against Complexity at one Black Ops 2 event, or something like that. It was a slums hardpoint, I believe, and like, people don't consider that like the most lopsided hardpoint of all time because that was literally 13, 14 years ago at this point. Um, but nonetheless, it's just overall just wasn't a great performance for Kenny, wasn't a great performance for OpTic in general because they're on a slide at this point, and it's a lot of losing at this point. Have at least before their next match of the weekend. And I just, I mean, like you kind of said, it's just there was, it's not so long ago that like the last time OpTic and Thieves played, I'm pretty sure they even showed it on broadcast. Like Kenny got a 1v2 clutch in game 5, round 11, for OpTic to beat LA Thieves, and that happened. It happened in the Major 1 qualifier, so that was at most 2 months ago. Like we're not super far removed from that, but since that match has happened, a lot has changed, obviously, and just LA Thieves have been on fire. OpTic have been on the opposite of fire, and that's what we saw here. It was just,
It was like
regardless of the narratives and the talk around OpTic, this was the expected result, I feel like, for most people.
yeah, this was kind of like the culmination of these two teams trending in opposite directions. Like, unless OpTic was able to kind of pull out the skid, it did feel like this was just inevitable. Granted, the stats for Kenny were so bad that it's like, holy crap! Like, I think people are already on that train, and if he had like a decently bad series, I think it would still be kind of the same because of them losing 3-0. But it was just like, holy crap! Like this is real bad, and I think it's a good thing that this happened then, and then they finished out on a high note versus the opposite where they win and then they do this series and then that happens. I think that would have been bad for the momentum, and bad for like the vibes, I guess, going into this event. But we'll get there in a little bit about OpTic's second match. Saturday, March 15th, we started off with Miami and Boston. I picked against Boston like one time, and they end up winning this series. The Breach, they win 3-1, have like one of the closest hard points of the season in the opening map, and then they go to round 11, 3-1 control, and then another very close hard point that Boston ends up winning, which is I guess is big for Boston. I think the fact that they've been like real up and down lately has been I don't think a surprise, because the surprise was how they performed in the Major 1 qualifiers, but this is a big win just in terms of like the hierarchy of that, the mid to lower portion of the standings. The Breach winning this is a big thing for them. What do you think of Boston winning 3-1 here?
Yeah, I think I forget exact numbers they showed it. I know we've talked about it before, but um, in terms of control, Boston has been one of the worst control teams in the league this entire season. I don't think Miami was that far behind them though. So that was interesting heading into this map, in the sense of it was a 1-1 series at that time, and Boston was actually able to win the control. Um, and I think that had to have been, good momentum for them, especially if it's a mode they've struggled in all year. And really, in both hard points, I didn't write it down for the first hard point, but I'm pretty sure in both hard points, it felt like Boston had opportunities to win, and especially in map 4, they had a very healthy lead that started to slip away towards the end. So it's not like these two teams are very, far apart, I would say, at this point. And at this time, I believe this was it was before LAG had played either of their matches, and the word on the watch parties and broadcast was that this match would determine who would get the last winners bracket spot assuming LAG lost both of their matches, which, in fairness, you couldn't really assume that with LAG versus OpTic as their last match, but for it is what it is. So this was a match that, it felt like it was a little more high stakes, and Boston did show up and clinch that last winners bracket spot to, we had talked about it previously before Major One, which was not hosted by Miami, but was in Spain, so it was kind of a home event for the Heretics, even though it wasn't really a home event. But we did, just in their sense, they didn't want to be in the loser back at the start because of that, and they were able to make it happen at the end of the Major One qualifiers to start in winners bracket. It's not the same situation for them this time around. They're going to be starting in the loser bracket at Major Two, along with the actual host of this event, OpTic. So, a bit of a shakeup there from the winners and losers bracket perspective, but nonetheless, I think this was an important one for Boston, not only because it allowed them to get that a coveted spot in the winners bracket to start, but it was a match where they were able to get a control win, which if you're a team that's been struggling in any mode, whether it's hard point search or control, you're struggling in that mode, you're able to get a win heading into a LAN event. That's got to be like a good confidence boost. And just overall for Boston, I feel like this had to have been, a good way for them to round out the qualifiers.
Yeah, for sure. Like, they've had a tough go of it. And granted, that's, I think it's been big for them to actually win matches consistently, versus last year where they were just losing pretty much everything. They finished these qualifiers 3-4. Like you said, like getting into the winners bracket is like a huge success for them. We talked about it when they made the Major One qualifiers, like in the winners bracket. Like that's a big accomplishment for that team in particular. Not every team is going to celebrate it and should celebrate it, but for Boston, who went so long without any, like anywhere close to the winners bracket, for them to do that in back-to-back majors is really, really big. So, congrats to them. Next match on Saturday was LAT versus Minnesota. I don't really think there's much to talk about here. LAT win, and they had a very impressive map streak going on. They had tied Atlanta FaZe's map streak going into. So they win the first two maps really convincingly. They even 100-point club Minnesota, which was kind of surprising, the fact that LAT was so dominant. They win the Surge 6-2, and then they go into Hacienda control, and then Minnesota snaps that map streak, and LAT and now FaZe are tied for that record, and then LAT finish it off with a hard point win to finish off the. I should mention, so they don't get the record, but then they finish the qualifier 7-0, which is a pretty big deal. They only lose, I think, 2 maps all qualifiers, so I think they went 21-2, which I don't know I don't know if anybody said that, but that has to be the best or one of the very best records in the qualifiers. Granted, not a lot of teams have played 7 series in the qualifiers, but even the map win percentage has to be up there. If you look at 5 wins or 6 wins, but LAT win this, they just don't get the record that they were going after as well.
Yeah, I think you kind of took the words right out of my mouth. It is interesting that now we have the record is 13 maps, and neither FaZe and Cold War nor LA Thieves this year able to get that 14th map. So it may be 13 is that magic number. It's going to be tough for any team to really get to 14 if these two teams that are like two historically, well, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves with LA Thieves, but two really talented teams, that's safe to say, weren't able to get to 14. Who's going to be that team to get to 14 maps in a row if it ever does happen? That's interesting. But bigger picture, like you said, yeah, they're 21-2 in maps. I don't know exactly if that is the best. It definitely has to be up there, but overall too, they lost the control here to Minnesota. The other map loss that they had was a control to Vegas Falcons. So they went undefeated in hardpoint, undefeated in search, and they have been widely considered the best control team in the game so far. And that's the only maps they lost. And one they lose to Vegas, where even like on the watch party they were joking how like I'm pretty sure I don't remember what map it was on now. It had to have been the Skyline search. There or a Skyline on there where they made an underground play that they were talking about. But regardless, that's like, you know, the fact that they have been, I feel like undisputed. Most people consider them the top control team, and that's the only mode they've lost so far in these qualifiers. Like, this is the team that people were expecting, and these are the results they were expecting when this quote unquote super team was announced in the offseason heading into this year. They just have to translate it into a championship. Yeah, they won the minor, but this is, you know, when you're playing this well, like it's basically you ain't first, your last. Shout out Ricky Bobby.
Yeah. They so like you mentioned, they are definitively the best control team in the league. They are now 20-5 in control on the season, which is an 80% map control win percentage. The second place team in terms of control win percentage is the Atlanta FaZe. They've won 62.5% of their controls. So no other team has higher than a 63% control win percentage, and LAT has an 80%. So that really shows it, and obviously that it kind of dragged them down a little bit, the fact that they lost two controls in these qualifiers. But I mean that's just crazy. Like they have. Like I can't say that they're definitively the best team, because we have to see FaZe versus LAT, or we just have to see these two teams on LAN again to really get a sense of that. But LAT certainly, like if you wanted to say that they're the best, then like it's really hard to argue against that, especially against Minnesota. Like, granted, Minnesota hasn't been like a dominant team or whatever, but Minnesota is a decent team, and they made pretty quick work of them, at least in two of these maps. Next up, we have Vegas versus Carolina. Carolina wins 3-1. No surprise in the fact that they won. Vegas did win the control, though. They won 3-2, but still, the hard point streak continues. We had LAT on a near historic map win streak, and this is definitely, there's no other team that has ever lost this many hard points in a row. Vegas, they lose not only their 25th hard point consecutively, but their 26th hard point consecutively. But they were very close maps, so we'll give it to that. And I saw that Clay had said, kind of it's like a heartbreaker. Like even though people, see what the results are, he kind of commended the guys on like the fact that they keep fighting, that they're really trying to win. It's just not working out in their favor. What do you think of this series?
Yeah, I believe the listen-in for Carolina was in map 4. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was. Nonetheless, when there was a listen-in with Carolina, the most polite way I can phrase this is the listen-in, you could tell they were playing against the Vegas Falcons. They were not energetic or enthusiastic. It didn't sound like they were playing in the grand finals of a LAN event. Like they were, the comms were, it was almost like it
Like they
didn't
were
sound
scrimming?
like it didn't sound like match day comms against any team, let alone against Vegas Falcons. So not taking anything away from Falcons here or Carolina, that Carolina is able to get the job done, but the hard points were pretty sloppy, and these were, I mean, I don't remember the score of the game when Xnid dropped 52 against OpTic. I know that one went down to the wire. But it's very possible these are two of the closest hard points that Vegas have had, and they were their best chances to get that first hard point win. But it really just, especially once that listening happened, it became pretty clear to me, and even like Methods and Scump on the watch party were kind of saying like it felt like to them too that the comms weren't as energetic as they would potentially be against other teams, and that could have been a factor in why the maps were so close. Especially like, again, not to keep on harping on the Vegas train, but like just a day removed from playing Miami, where Carolina wins 250 to 199, and Gwen's dropping 41, and there were their matches last week against C9 where Carolina won both those hard points when I said Gwen went like 38 and 21 or whatever it was. So it's like, we've talked at points this year about Carolina's hard point, and it's again not expected to be their strongest mode, but you expect Carolina to play better against a historically bad hardpoint team in Vegas here. Um, so I don't want to say that that's overly concerning for Carolina heading into the major, just based on what else we saw from Carolina and hardpoint over these qualifiers. But definitely, it's worth mentioning, I feel like, and I gotta, at least from like a score standpoint, I feel like these are two of the closest maps that Vegas have had in terms of almost hitting that coveted 250 mark in a hard point.
It's certainly something that the Carolina coaching staff should take seriously. Like, the fact that like, if you want to say they took their foot off the gas or they weren't taking it seriously, like if that is the case, or even even if it isn't the case, then it's concerning that it wasn't one-sided, that it was as close as it was, especially when you look at the S&D. Like, the S&D was super one-sided, 6-0 for Carolina, but the respawns were about as close as Vegas has played anybody this year. The fact that they won a control, the fact that they nearly won both of these hard points, like, this is the closest that Vegas has had to a single win so far this season, and Carolina, both the players and the coaching staff, should say, like, that is unacceptable. That's like disrespectful to Vegas in a way, but like, it's also Vegas. Like, they shouldn't be this close, especially to a team like Carolina, who, maybe they aren't going to win a championship, at least in my opinion, but they should be competing for like the top 4 at the major. And Vegas is almost assuredly going to finish without a win at Major 2. So like, these two teams shouldn't be anywhere near each other in a single match. The next up, we had LAG versus Atlanta. Atlanta, this is a very close series, all things considered. The only real lopsided result was the Protocol S&D that Atlanta won 6-2, but the first hard point was separated by 10 points. The second hard point was separated by 26 points. LAG wins the control. LAG has been undoubtedly one of the worst teams in the league this season. Atlanta has been one of the best, if not the best. So to see this be so close is a pretty big surprise, I would say. But Atlanta does come out with the win. Your thoughts on this match?
Yeah, I think that was, again, it's hard to say what I'm about to say when I know what happened in the matches today. But at this time, when this match was happening yesterday, LAG looked very competitive against Atlanta FaZe, especially in the hard points. And even on the Scump watch party, Methods was kind of like echoing this sentiment of not necessarily being worried, but that was the thought. Like, LAG was playing better in this match than most people were expecting, and heading into a matchup with OpTic, where OpTic were looking to avoid going 0-7 or 0-21 map count, that had to be a little concerning, or just a thought in the back of the Greenwall's head. But yeah, I mean, especially based on the way LAG played this series, I was thinking the same thing. Like, damn, the first match tomorrow on Sunday, OpTic versus LAG. LAG's probably got a better chance. I know in the pick'em you picked LAG, I picked OpTic. I wasn't super thrilled about picking OpTic, but just the teams on paper, you expect OpTic to beat a team like LAG, especially the way LAG had been playing. But the way OpTic had been playing, it doesn't. That doesn't necessarily line up exactly the way you'd think. But just the way LAG competed against Atlanta in this match. They don't get the job done, but the maps were very close. And really, even the search, which was a 6-2, there was a play where Draza gets a 1v2 on protocol search where he like jumps across one of the doorways in the bottom A bomb site. And like that happens when FaZe is up 1-0, so it's not like that's happening 5-5, but like that was a position bomb down for LAG with a man advantage. That's around they should win. Um, so like you could argue that even if Draza doesn't make that clutch, like the S&D could have been even closer. And then all 4 maps in the series are really close. So just kind of, we'll get into the LAG and OpTic map here, but based on the way LAG had played against Atlanta, I was expecting, I wouldn't say necessarily a different result, but I was expecting at the very least the LAG and OpTic match to be pretty competitive.
And it was, I think it's just easier to move to this next match because this was, I think still the LAT OpTic match is like the match of the weekend in a sense because of Kenny's performance and the talk around that match. But if you're looking at some positive result, at least for one section of the fans and a giant section of the fans, it's this match. The first match on Sunday was OpTic versus LAG. Both these teams, I had talked about it literally last weekend that I couldn't definitively say that OpTic was the second worst team in the league because they hadn't played LAG recently, but we were going to get that this weekend. And now we can definitively say that OpTic is not the second worst team in the league right now. They might be the third. I think it's pretty clear that they're certainly in that bottom tier. At least if, maybe this is the sign of things to come or whatever. But LAG, they lose 3-1 to OpTic, giving OpTic their first win of these qualifiers, their first win in a while since that Vegas Falcons minor win. It gives them their first map victories since that win, which is just crazy. They went 0-18 to start these qualifiers, and so they finished these qualifiers with a whopping what was that, a 3-19 map record in these qualifiers. But it was like it wasn't like a clean win necessarily. It wasn't like, oh, OpTic just smashed them, but this is definitely the best that they've looked in a long time. They win the first hard point by more than 80. They win the second hard point by almost 60. The S&D they'd lose, but they win the control. This is just like, if we knew nothing about the performance of these teams, this is the OpTic that you would expect. They won the respawns, they lost the search, but like everything kind of went relatively smoothly. Is that kind of the vibe that you got from this match?
They won a freaking map, right? Like they were 0-18 map count heading into this series. So not only do they get a series win, they get a map win. Like that had to have been just a huge, weight off their shoulders, weight off their chest. And after that, it's hard to say getting a map win led to it, but just Pred went on a massive streak in the map 4 protocol hardpoint. I think he started like 11-1 or 12-1, something like that. And he was just frying that map. Like he was all over the place. And that's kind of like, I don't want to say we haven't seen it. I don't think we've really seen anyone on OpTic individually stand out very much and many maps over an 0-18 record streak. But that felt like, the Pred that you would expect when Pred joins OpTic even before last year. Like you expect him to be just this roaming SMG who's just getting kills all over the place. And that's really, at least in my memory, the first time we've really seen that, at least in his return to the lineup, where he was just running all over the place, doing what he wanted and picking up kills. So again, it's small sample size. They finally got a win. That's got to be a huge check for them. Got a map win, got a series win. Heading into their home major, they're still starting in the loser bracket. Not where they want to be, but nothing they can do about that now. Now you just head into this event, and if you're just OpTic, you got to believe in the talent that you have as a team. All those guys know how talented they are. if it's me, like being Karma or JP or whatever, like especially someone like Kenny, like you don't even look at the stats from these qualifiers. You throw it out the window. You know you're a world champion. You know you're a multi-time champion on land. Like heading into a land event, you throw all that up past stuff out the window, and you just tunnel vision ahead on the land matchups and focus on that for now, and try and get back to the form that you're capable of, even if it hasn't shown in this title in particular. You know what you can do as a Call of Duty player on local area network, like flush out the noise, flush out all that stuff, and just focus on the task at hand ahead. It's going to be a tough journey, but I mean, 1-6. Not going to sit here and seem like 1-6 is massively better than 0-7,
Yeah.
but it is definitely better than 0-7 or 0-21 map count. Like you got to take what you can if you're an OpTic fan, and you got to. It's where they go from here at this point. Like I was just saying for the LAG Atlanta match, it's a little weird to me that it felt like LAG was more competitive with Atlanta than OpTic. That doesn't like really add up to me, especially in less than a 24-hour window. It was the last match on Saturday and the first match today, so it's even, I mean, less than, I don't know, like 16 hours, something in that vicinity. That seemed a little weird to me, but regardless, I think it feels inevitable. Change is coming for LAG, especially if they lose first round here. But then again, I said with this team, I don't really know what the answer is unless they just like start blowing it up and maybe bring in someone like Cobra, or just make changes in general to try and execute on that French identity fandom. But regardless, for OpTic, I just think, yeah, like, 1-6 still sucks, still isn't great, but you got to win there and you got to build on it if you want to, things to improve.
Yeah, that's the point I wanted to make. That it can't be understated how much of an improvement 1-6 and 3-19 is over 0-7 and 0-21. Like, there's just, especially when you end with the win. Like I said a little bit ago, had they flipped these results and they beat LAG earlier in the weekend, and then they rounded out with a humiliating loss against LAT where Kenny has this horrific series, it's a little bit different. Like, it would certainly, that momentum is gone again. Like, all the hope that you would have of, oh look, we won, we beat LAG, and then LAT happened, and like now we're kind of down in the dumps again. I think it's different now. That's not to say that it will change anything at Major 2 though. Because that's just how Call of Duty is. Like, you could go from like what we saw with OpTic in the Major 1 qualifiers, where they were incredible in those qualifiers. They finished first in the they had the first place, the first seed at Major 1, and then they come out at Major 1 and look horrible. So like, it could be the opposite for them. They could come in to Major 2 after having this horrendous qualifier series, and then they win a few matches at Major 2. They make a run at Major 2, but it's completely impossible to predict at this point in time. I did want to point out though, something I mentioned on the pre-show before we went live, was Scump had said before today's matches that OpTic had actually moved the rooms from which they were playing these CDL matches. They moved them, I think, before today. I think it was after the LAT series. So I just thought that was interesting. Obviously, they did win this match, so I'm sure they will be playing the Major 3 qualifiers from whatever room they played today, because there's no reason to change that up. You even said, like, one of the players might have had no socks on today or whatever, and they win, and now he doesn't have to play with socks for at least the time period. It's just, that is like how Call of Duty is. Like, guys that fix like their sense, they change their sense all the time. Like, oh, I had a bad series, like let's bump it up like 0.5 or whatever. Like that kind of stuff is certainly like just a mental block, I guess. Maybe there is some kind of, I wouldn't say like internet issue, but like, I don't know, maybe there is some kind of like bad juju in that room, and they do need to move out of that room to get a better result or whatever. But I mean, it's, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of whatever superstitions they're trying to conjure up, finishing with this win is huge for them. because, like you said, it gets the monkey off their back. They're able to breathe a little bit better, but it's the monkey is kind of going to creep back onto their back, I think, if they lose their first round series at Major 2, especially in front of their home fans. If it is a lopsided loss as well, then it's like, okay, that win kind of meant nothing. That means more, I guess, for LAG's sake than it does for OpTic. And I will say, like, LAG are, like, this is just a really sad way for this season to have went with, I wouldn't say like they were thought to be a championship contender by any means, but it was not supposed to be like this. It was not supposed to be definitively the second worst team in the league, 2, 3, or more than 3 months into the season. They have to make a roster change, another roster change. They probably have to just kind of overhaul this team, and probably think like maybe only Kiz and Linz are staying, and like let's try something new, because right now, like, they're at real risk of missing champs, and like, they're gonna have to do some work to make sure that they don't miss champs, which is pretty crazy to think after bringing in 3/4 of a former championship team. But that's kind of the way that it's went for LAG. OpTic, on the other hand, they're probably gonna have to do some work as well. But they at least got this win, and have some positive things to think about going into next weekend.
And just real quick to shout out Brian Stats on Twitter at Brian Stats1. He said that OpTic have beaten LAG 13 straight times over the last 5 years, and Shotzi is 15-0 in his career against LAG. Obviously, it's a little bit different now that they've rebranded to Gentlemates, but Shotzi's 3-0 against Gentlemates now, and Shotzi's earlier part of his career would have been on Dallas before OpTic, so that's why there's a little bit of a different numbers there. But 15-0 is kind of ridiculous. I mean, I know for a fact, because for whatever reason, one of the series of all time that sticks out in my mind is LAG beating Atlanta FaZe in an online qualifier in Cold War on Express Search and Destroy. So I know, like, even like someone like Simp is not undefeated against LAG in his history. So 15-0, that's not like 1-0 or 2-0 against the team. That's a healthy sample size, and he is undefeated against that franchise. So it might be one of those. If this was real sports, it'd be like you go to the Wikipedia page and you'd look up the LAG owner, and they would have Shotzi's name there instead of Kroenke.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. Like, I mean, LAG has obviously had LAT's number, like, at least compared to how they have performed otherwise. And we've seen Atlanta have OpTic's number most recently. Some teams are just I even without the rosters staying the same. Like, sometimes that's just how it goes. And LAG, granted, LAG has been really bad for like the majority of their time in the CDL. Barring a few events or a little stint here and there, but they're not in a good space right now. Minnesota versus Vancouver was the next match. Vancouver wins this 3-1. Minnesota wins the Search and Destroy. So if you want to have a talking point, of course, Vancouver does lose that first series. Okay, like, you can kind of move past that. I think the one thing is that they went 0-3 in S&D, but like I said earlier, the optimism that you could have about Vancouver is that S&D should be something that you're continually improving on and working on. So maybe it will get better as time goes on, but that doesn't necessarily bode well for this weekend, I guess. Like, if they maybe they might have to go to a Game 5, and the fact that they went 0-3 this weekend might be a little concerning for their fans. What do you think of this series? Obviously, Vancouver winning is not really a surprise, but maybe the way that they won could be a little bit of a surprise.
I don't think it's necessarily a surprise. Just, again, even looking back at the Toronto series and even the LAT matches dating back to the minor, that's really, like, they've looked strong in hardpoint, and S&D has been a weakness. I don't know the exact record for them with Neptune in the lineup, but I just I think it's, off the top of my head, their hardpoint record would be pretty good, and their search record, it probably is decent, but it's definitely, probably closer to 500, or maybe like a 10-8, something like that. That's probably too many maps to have played since Neptune joined, but regardless of the exact numbers, yeah, I think that could be like a vulnerability for them heading into this weekend if teams are able to. I think even Neptune did the post game interview after this match, and he kind of alluded to thinking that at least even in the Toronto match, it felt like they had watched their VOD heading into the searches, and maybe that's just something they're gonna have to switch some things up in the searches. Especially for a newer team, we just know, for the most part in Call of Duty history, when a new team is formed or a roster change is made, even I back it up a second, even in professional Call of Duty, search and destroy is not practiced a ton on the team level. They, even in scrims, you don't scrim search for the most part. It's mostly respawns, and if you want to do separate S&D scrims, it's usually against like amateurs, and there used to be tournaments you would play, but that's not as big of a thing anymore. Especially when a roster change is made, you're more focusing on those respawns than the searches. So it wouldn't surprise me, especially with someone like Rambo as the coach for this Vancouver team, if they were really dialed in on the hard points and using repetitive strats in search that are like good sound strats, but if you do them enough, other teams catch on, and that might be what's happening here. I don't know for sure. But I just think overall for Vancouver heading into this major, that's what it looks like. Surge could be something we'll have to keep an eye on for them. But I do think just overall for Vancouver, there are going to be pundits or critics ready to jump on this team if they don't perform on LAN and just be like, oh, it was a honeymoon phase. Oh, they're just playing well online, et cetera, et cetera. So that's something I'm going to be interested to see how this squad performs on LAN heading into the major. But I just think overall, really, for me, even Neptune kind of said like he feels like he hasn't been playing as well in the recent matches, and like Puckett made it. I forget the exact numbers. He's like, "Oh, you went from a 1.3 KD to a 1.1 or something like that. Yeah, you're terrible." And it's kind of like a joke. But I think for me, really, since the minor grand finals against Thieves, Abuza has been the player for me that's really stood out for this Vancouver team. I feel like he's really started to step it up, and that's something we even saw it last year. Like, I know last year's a little different story just because there was like that role thing where he was using a sub early on. It took a while for him to get onto his preferred main AR role. That hasn't been the case this year, but I still feel like he wasn't really playing at the same level we saw at the end of last year, and I feel like he's really stepped it up in the recent qualifiers, and since that minor grand finals, even though they lost that grand finals, I felt like he played really well in that match. So I'm looking. I know a lot of people are going to have their eyes on Neptune for this squad, obviously, in his return to a CDL LAN event. But I want to see how Abuza continues to try and play. If he keeps on improving and playing well, him and just, if he's playing well and Neptune's playing anywhere close to how he's played in these online matches, Vancouver's going to be a scary team. And I think the same thing for Minnesota. I've been on the Estriel train a little bit now. Since the start of the season, I had my eyes on Nero, and Geo being those like star slayers, but I really feel like Estriel has just, especially in the major 2 qualifiers, he's just been that guy who's been frying for Minnesota, even though the matches haven't, all gone the way Minnesota would have liked. So I'm excited to see what Minnesota is able to do. They got a tough first round matchup against FaZe, but exciting times coming up with the major. I went off a little bit on a tangent there, but I do think overall from this series, a lot of people have high expectations for Vancouver now since the Neptune change. And this is kind of, Minnesota had tough matches this week, but they didn't get blown out, and they were competitive against the 2 teams that were in the finals of the minor. So I don't think Minnesota is like some pushover heading into the major despite going in with an 0-2 week.
I don't know if we talked about it in regards to Vancouver. I know we talked about it with Minnesota, but part of like what we like the preseason stuff that we talked about, Minnesota, their ceiling was kind of dependent on if one or multiple of their guys could take a step up or, kind of elevate their game and elevate their team as a result. Vancouver is really in that boat as well. I don't know if we said that in particular with them, but of course we didn't know what Neptune was. We didn't know Neptune was going to be in the roster. We didn't know that he was going to have this big of an impact. But we did talk about with Abuza and Ofor, if those guys were able to take a step up in their second season in the CDL, how much of an improvement the Surge could have as a result of that. And we're seeing that with Abuza, like you said. Like if Abuza is able to stay at this level, and even if Neptune stays, even if he's not at the top of what he was when he first came in, and he's just kind of like a very good player still, that team is very, very hard to beat regardless of their opponent. And we saw that with LAT. We've seen that with FaZe, that this team is difficult to play against, to strategize against. And I don't think the fact that this was a decently close series in some ways, I don't think it really matters, because Minnesota has shown that they can compete against these teams and be competitive. But it does say a lot. And I think going back to the point that we made earlier about Carolina, we can make the same point about Vancouver. We can kind of nitpick a little bit. And not just saying we, but kind of like the community as a whole. We could say Vancouver's not as good as they were early to start these qualifiers, like right when Neptune came in. They've kind of fell off a little bit. Like the fact that they're in these positions to begin with is pretty crazy, and it says a lot of how Neptune has elevated. I guess I can't just say just him, but his arrival has kind of sparked this elevation and this improvement across the board for this team. And now they enter Major 2 with a real chance to win, which is pretty crazy considering what Vancouver was just a few months ago in the Major 1 qualifiers. The last match on Sunday, the last qualifying match of the Major 2 qualifiers, C9 versus Atlanta. We talked about how this might be a little bit of a weird series because of the internet stuff, but I don't know if there was any drama about that. But Atlanta wins predictably. They do win this series, but I mean, what a way to end it! This wasn't the most competitive series necessarily for the most part, but then we get to Hacienda Hardpoint, and we have one of the closer hard points that we've had all season long. I saw people saying that was one of the most entertaining hard points of the year. What do you think about Atlanta winning this and particularly that last hard point of the qualifiers?
Yeah, I definitely thought that was a banger ending. I mean, it looked like Atlanta was going to close it out, and then they kind of, went 3-4 down, and then Cloud9 was in a position to close it out, it seemed like, and they kind of went 3-4 down. So it was a bit of a mixy ending for, I don't really like the word mixy, but I know it's a COD phrase that people in the community use. So for lack of a better term, a little bit of a mixy ending there. But nonetheless, yeah, this series overall wasn't as close outside. Obviously, that map was super close to the Hacienda, but the other three maps weren't necessarily super close, especially map 1, Cell drops a 2 KD, 33 and 16. He was absolutely freezing. Protocol Search, C9 winning that is a little interesting, especially because we just saw Atlanta play that and win 6-2 against LAG. So could have been, I'd have to look at the numbers and look at, their exact record on S&D maps, but maybe it was a case of Atlanta practicing a search map heading into the major. I'm not 100% sure there, but that, they played in both matches this week. So makes me think that's at least a possibility. And unless it could sound stupid if it's one of their better S&D maps, but nonetheless, yeah, I mean, it definitely, especially that last map was a better showing from C9 of at least of their potential. It is just a little interesting though that even outside of that map 1 protocol hardpoint against C9, you could say LAG's match against Atlanta felt a little bit more competitive than Atlanta's match against Cloud9, which just that seems a little off to me. But uh, regardless, I think this is what you expect from Atlanta. They end the qualifiers 6-1 with their only loss. Their only loss should be the first match against Vancouver with Neptune, I believe.
Yep.
So that's that is what it is. It's interesting at least that and maybe at a time just because like the minor was in the middle there where it may have felt like Atlanta isn't like the top dog, quote unquote, just because like they didn't play as well in the minor. They had that loss to Vancouver, and LA Thieves have looked so strong. At least in my eyes, maybe like that opens the door for people to be like, yeah, Atlanta's not the best team in the game, LA Thieves is. And based on the performances and the records, I guess you can't really argue it. But like 6-1 record isn't. It doesn't feel like Atlanta is as far behind that. Like if I was thinking of those thoughts, I would thought Atlanta maybe went like 4-3 in these qualifiers or something like that. But they still went 6-1, which is obviously really good. So, good win for them here heading into the major. Pretty clear cut in my eyes that we got a 2-team race at least heading into the major, and we'll be able to talk more in depth about that on the next show in terms of breaking down the bracket and stuff. But I guess I'll say it now just because it's on my mind and I don't want to forget it. The way the bracket shakes out, Vancouver is not on FaZe's side of the bracket. If FaZe were to play Vancouver, they would have to play in the winners finals, which would mean Vancouver would have to be LA Thieves, which we haven't seen yet. So that sets the stage up. If teams are playing as well and are playing to the expectations, we could get another scrap versus Draza showdown in winners finals, potentially in the grand finals, and that is something people definitely want to see.
Yeah, I was actually going to say the same thing about FaZe, how they could be underrated basically coming into this major just because LAT has looked so far and away the most dominant. And like you said, the minor kind of messed things up because if we take the minor out of it and they just go 6-1 in these and they lose that first match and then they win 6 in a row, that's basically how OpTic did it in the first qualifiers. And there was
right.
understandably there was a lot of hype around OpTic going into that first major, but the minor changed things because it's a loss to start off the qualifiers, and then they beat OpTic, they beat Miami, and then they lose again to Vancouver, and then they finished off with 4 wins, admittedly over teams that haven't had very strong runs. Just their schedule in general wasn't kind of set up for that. They played, most of the bottom teams in these qualifiers, Vancouver and C9 being like notable exceptions. But still, like this is the team that just won Major 1 not too long ago. They haven't played LAT since then, so we haven't like that. That's my thing is like I can't say that LAT is better because it's not like we even saw these two teams play online since then. That was one of the closest grand final series of all time, the Major 1 grand finals between LAT and FaZe. But FaZe right now are still the team to beat because LAT hasn't proven that they can beat that team. And, hopefully we'll see that at Major 2. We'll see that matchup again. But yeah, that is something that I was thinking about, how FaZe could be underrated. And I looked it up. They're 18-2 in their last 20 matches, FaZe is. So that shows obviously they had that rough start to the regular season. They lost 3 straight. But, since then they've been almost flawless. Other than those Vancouver matches, they have won every other match. So maybe Vancouver is the kryptonite, and if we see those two teams play each other, we wouldn't see it until the winners finals at the earliest, it seems like. But that could be something to watch out for. But yeah, that concludes the Major 2 qualifiers. The standings are as follows: first place, LAT at 7-0. Second place, Atlanta FaZe at 6-1. There was a 3-way tie for third place between the Toronto Ultra, Carolina Royal Ravens, and Vancouver Surge. But Toronto gets the 3rd seed, Carolina gets the 4th, and Vancouver gets the 5th seed. Then C9 got the 6th seed at 4 and 3, and then there was a two-way tie for 7th and 8th. Minnesota gets the 7th seed at 3 and 4. Boston also 3 and 4 gets the 8th seed. And the bottom 4 teams, they will be starting Major 2 in the losers bracket. 9th place, the Miami Heretics at 2 and 5. OpTic getting 10th place. They got the tiebreaker over LAG with that final win. LAG obviously getting 11th at 1 and 6, just the same as OpTic. And then at 0 and 7, the Vegas Falcons in 12th place. The way that the bracket is set up.
Wins than OpTic, though.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think OpTic had the worst map win percentage of any team. Maybe Vegas had like a slightly, like it's almost the exact same. I'm trying to look up the standings real quick. OpTic was 3 and 9, and Vegas was 4 and 21 in these qualifiers. Oh yeah, 3 and 19. OpTic did have the worst map win percentage. They won 13.6% of their maps in these qualifiers. Vegas won 16%. No other team had less than 30.8. So that kind of shows what these qualifiers were like. But the bracket is set up as such. LAT and Boston play in the first round. Carolina versus Vancouver. So that should be a really, really fun match. Atlanta versus Minnesota. We'll see if Minnesota is able to pull off the upset. And then Toronto and C9 will finish out winners bracket round 1. And like I said, Miami, Vegas, OpTic, and LAG, are starting in the losers bracket. So they'll, OpTic, they could have Atlanta FaZe drop down to the losers bracket for them. I was saying before the show that the best scenario for them would have been Boston dropping down into the losers bracket, but that's just not how things work out with the standings. And Miami, they because they are the best of the bottom 4 in terms of record and seeding, it does make sense that they would get Boston if they were to drop down into the losers bracket, because Boston is probably the worst team in that winners bracket. But we'll see what happens. We'll talk about Major 2 and talk about all of the storylines, and we'll preview and give our predictions for it on the next episode. But yeah, the pick'em. So I went 7 and 3 this week. You went 9 and 1. So we basically, like, these last 2 weeks were identical on record. So you're 84 and 40 on the year. I'm 77 and 47 on the season. But yeah, we'll be back on Wednesday to talk about Major 2, preview the whole tournament. It should be a really fun event, if not just for, kind of watching OpTic and seeing what they do at their home major. I believe this is also at the same arena that Champs was held last season, if I'm not mistaken. So that should be, that was, a great atmosphere. I hope it's the exact same setup where they're in the middle of the arena. I think that was a really cool thing for Champs. But we will talk to you then. Make sure to subscribe, follow, or like the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and of course YouTube. You can go to the YouTube channel, just search up Ego Chall Podcast, and you can get all of our videos, all the VODs and everything. You can also watch you can watch live on YouTube, or you can watch live on Twitch, twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast. You can also follow Bink on Twitch, twitch.tv/JBink with 2 Ks. That's JBINKK. And he's at over 60 days consecutively streaming, so go and support him. You can also follow us on Twitter at JBink with 2 Ks, at Preston Byers, the podcast stories, at Ego Chall Podcast. In the next show, like I said, will be probably on Wednesday, which will be March 19th. Yeah. So no, it's fine. But yeah, we'll be back Wednesday for the live show, and the podcast will go into your feeds on Thursday the 20th. That does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, thank you guys as always for all the support. This is our favorite time of the year when we get to, do the previews for the LAN and break down the LAN events. So it makes all the online Call of Duty worth it. And looking forward to this upcoming event. Got some juicy storylines and should be a good one. So we'll be back in a couple days to break it all down for you. Hope you join us then. And